America is collapsing faster than anyone is willing to admit. Welcome to the collapse of America. And before you scroll away, you need to understand something. This isn't theory anymore. This is happening right now, and the numbers are terrifying. 62% of Americans can't afford a $1,000 emergency. Household debt just hit $17.5 trillion, and more people filed for bankruptcy this year than during the 2008 financial crisis. Homeownership is now at its lowest point for young adults in U.S. history. The birth rate just dropped to 1.62, and over 28 million Americans are living with their parents because they simply cannot afford to move out. Meanwhile, corporate profits are at record highs, the dollar's global dominance is shrinking, and trust in government institutions just hit an all-time low of 8%. I'm going to show you exactly why this country is unraveling from the inside out and why millions of Americans don't even realize they're standing in the middle of a slow-motion national collapse. Welcome to the end of America, as you know it. What's hitting Americans hardest right now isn't just inflation or layoffs or even the insane cost of housing. It's the fact that the American paycheck has stopped functioning as a meaningful financial tool. And I don't think people fully grasp how historically unprecedented this is, because when you zoom out and look at the data, what we're dealing with right now isn't a period of economic stress. It's the structural collapse of wage-based stability itself. For the first time since World War II, more than 62% of all Americans now live paycheck to paycheck, and among households earning six figures, that number is still hovering around 44%. That means nearly half of high-income earners people who were once the backbone of consumer strength are barely hanging on. And when you break down the math, it becomes obvious why. Over the last 20 years, the cost of housing rose 162%. Groceries rose over 40% just since 2020. Childcare rose 214%, and health insurance premiums more than tripled, while wages grew only 17% after adjusting for inflation. In other words, your paycheck didn't just fall behind, it was silently erased. And I say this with a sober tone because this is the core mechanism of a collapsing nation. When the majority of citizens cannot convert labor into stability, you no longer have a middle class, you have a working poor population pretending to be middle class because the alternative is admitting the country failed them. Meanwhile, the economy being advertised on TV, the one showing 30,000-point stock markets and trillion-dollar tech rallies, is an economy that only functions for people who already own assets. And that's the part nobody wants to say out loud. In 2026, for the first time ever, the top 10% owns 93% of all stock market wealth, while the bottom 50%, about 165 million people, own less than 1%. And when the Fed cuts rates to help Americans, what it's really doing is pumping liquidity into asset markets, which sends home prices even further out of reach. It's economic gravity at this point. A system where wages stay flat and asset prices hyperinflate becomes a system where entire generations are locked out forever. This isn't a cycle. It's not temporary. It's the kind of imbalance that historically marks the terminal phase of an empire. So when I say welcome to the collapse of America, this right here is where you feel it first. When working becomes a survival mechanism, not a path forward. The housing market that has already left Americans behind. America no longer has a housing market. It has a national asset bubble that functions like a private club, and the door has been slammed shut on ordinary people. And I'm going to break this down in a way that makes the picture painfully clear, because this is where the collapse of America stops being theoretical and becomes something you feel in your bones. Right now, the median home price in the United States is $431,000, while the median household income is $75,000. That gives us the worst affordability ratio since records began, worse than 2008, worse than the 1980 interest rate shock, worse than the 1970s stagflation era. For a typical American family to buy a typical American home today, they would need an income of $114,000, about 52% higher than the actual median household earns. That means the average American is no longer priced out, they are structurally mathematically excluded. And it gets even darker when you look at who's buying the homes. Institutional investors, BlackRock, Invitation Homes, private equity landlords now make up more than 1 out of every 5 home purchases in major metros. In Atlanta, Charlotte, and Phoenix, those numbers spike as high as 30 to 40%. These firms are buying the starter homes, the ones families used to buy first, and converting them into permanent rentals. That's why rents have risen 29% nationwide since 2020 and over 50% in growth metros. This isn't accidental. It's a transfer of generational opportunity, engineered through policy, interest rates, and acquisition strategies that favor capital over citizens. The American dream, buy a home, build equity, raise a family, has become a gated dream, accessible only to those who already have the wealth to secure it. And for younger Americans, this reality is catastrophic. More than 28 million young adults now live with their parents, an all-time high. First-time homebuyer participation is at its lowest level since 1981, and with mortgage rates refusing to fall below 6% even with rate cuts, it tells you everything. The system is broken at the foundation. Housing is no longer shelter. It's a wealth extraction machine. And once a country turns housing into a speculative arena instead of a human necessity, history shows the outcome is always the same. Declining birth rates, mass migration, political resentment, and a generational break with the nation's identity itself. So yes, welcome to the collapse of America, because when a population can't afford a home, the country is already gone. The silent death of the American worker, and the corporate shift toward disposable labor. What we're watching right now across the United States is something no politician wants to say out loud, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that the foundation of the country is cracking. The American worker is becoming obsolete. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because the data is screaming it from every direction. Over the past 24 months, more than 5.1 million full-time jobs have quietly vanished, replaced by part-time roles, gig labor, temp contracts, and algorithm-assigned shifts that treat human beings like interchangeable components. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps trotting out headline numbers showing job growth, but when you dig just an inch deeper, you learn those jobs overwhelmingly belong to hospitality, minimum wage service, and low-hour sectors that don't allow anyone to build a life. Meanwhile, corporations are reporting record productivity increases, but not because workers suddenly got better. It's because companies are replacing them with automation, AI decision systems, outsourced labor pools, and in-store technology that trims payroll to the bone. In 2026, more than 41% of companies with over 500 employees reported that they reduced full-time headcount specifically due to AI implementation. The IMF warned that nearly 40% of all global jobs are now directly vulnerable to AI displacement. But in the United States, the risk is closer to 60% because the American economy relies disproportionately on white-collar organizational work, exactly the kind being consumed by AI language models and automation tools. And here's the part that should terrify every viewer. Wages are no longer set by competition for labor. They're set by the minimum amount a corporation needs to pay to avoid public relations backlash. That's it. Companies don't need to raise wages because there is no shortage of desperate workers anymore. There is a surplus. American adults now work, on average, 1 extra job and 9 extra hours per week compared to 1 decade ago, and yet median savings are lower than at any point since 1972. Corporate profits as a share of GDP are at a 75-year high. Worker compensation as a share of GDP is at a 70-year low. The system is telling you something very loud and very clear. Labor is disposable now. And when a nation stops valuing its workers, when humans become cost centers instead of the core of the economy, that nation is on the same trajectory every fallen empire took right before its collapse. This is not a recession. It's not a cycle. It's the economic hollowing of a nation that no longer needs the people who built it. If you really want to understand why America is collapsing from the inside out, you don't need to look at inflation, wages, or even the debt crisis. You need to look at healthcare, because this is where the cruelty of the system becomes unavoidable. Right now, the United States has the most expensive healthcare system in the history of human civilization. And I'm not exaggerating. We spend $4.7 trillion a year. nearly 18% of GDP, which is more than double the average of other developed nations. And yet Americans have worse life expectancy, higher maternal mortality, higher chronic disease rates, and more medical bankruptcies than any wealthy country on the planet. And here's the detail that should make every viewer stop and stare. 62% of all personal bankruptcies in America are tied to medical debt. That means the majority of Americans who financially collapse do so because they got sick. In what universe can a nation survive when simply existing becomes a financial hazard? Premiums have risen over 300% since the year 2000. Employer-sponsored plans now average $24,000 per year, and deductibles routinely sit at $3,000 to $7,000 before coverage even kicks in. That means the insurance most Americans proudly say they have is effectively unusable until after they've drained their savings. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical spending is projected to cross $800 billion by 2030. Driven by price hikes that outpace inflation by a factor of 5. And while Americans drown in medical debt, top healthcare CEOs are earning compensation packages ranging from $30 million to $250 million, depending on the year. You see the pattern? The healthcare system is not designed to keep people alive. It's designed to extract wealth from them until they cannot resist the system anymore. And the collapse becomes visible when you look at the younger generations. Nearly 1 in 4 young Americans now skip medical care due to cost. 35% can't fill basic prescriptions. Over half say they would not be able to handle a $1,000 emergency bill. And when a society becomes too poor to stay healthy, everything else breaks. Productivity, birth rates, national morale, and long-term stability. America isn't collapsing because of one big event. It's collapsing because its citizens are being drained financially to keep the machine running. A nation cannot survive when the price of staying alive exceeds the income of its people. The energy crisis. No one is preparing for, and the infrastructure that's one heat wave away from failure. What almost nobody is talking about, but every serious analyst sees flashing in red, is that America is heading straight into an energy and infrastructure crisis that will redefine daily life in ways most people are not remotely prepared for. And I want to walk you through this slowly, because it's one of the clearest, most measurable signals of national decline we have right now. The U.S. electric grid, the thing we rely on for everything: communication, food storage, medical care, water systems, manufacturing, is now operating at an average age of 54 years, and in some regions, more than 70% of transmission lines are beyond their intended lifespan. We're using mid-20th century infrastructure to power a 21st century digital economy that requires exponentially more energy each year. And when you mix that with the explosion of data centers, which now consume 4% of all U.S. electricity, plus the rise of AI computing, electric vehicles, and the return of extreme summer heat waves that push demand to record highs, you get a mathematical certainty. The grid cannot handle what's coming. In 2025 and 2026 alone, more than 2/3 of Americans will live in regions facing high blackout risk, according to NERC, the agency that monitors grid reliability. Texas already came within minutes of a cascading grid collapse during the 2021 freeze. California experiences rolling blackouts every summer. New York City narrowly avoided a grid emergency last year during a heat wave. This isn't bad luck, it's structural instability. Meanwhile, energy prices have decoupled from wages entirely. Natural gas bills are up 36% since 2020. Electricity prices up 27%, and heating oil up by double digits every year. Americans are now paying European energy prices without European social protections. And here's the deeper collapse. Everything in America is connected to energy, food production, transportation, hospital equipment, digital banking, supply chains. When the grid becomes unreliable, the entire economy becomes unreliable. Nations don't fall from military defeat alone. They fall when their internal systems stop functioning consistently. And that's where America is drifting right now. You cannot sustain a nation when millions of people lose power every time a storm hits, when hospitals run backup generators for days, when small businesses close because their electric bills exceed their rent, and when data centers pull more electricity than entire cities. This is how empires fail, not in one dramatic blackout, but in a million small outages that reveal the country is unable to maintain the basic systems a modern civilization requires. Welcome to collapse disguised as temporary grid strain, the debt spiral that cannot reverse, and the moment a nation accepts it will never pay its bills. The United States has entered a debt spiral that no nation in history has ever escaped from without either default, restructuring, or total systemic overhaul. And before anyone says that sounds dramatic, let me give you the numbers, because once you see them, you realize this isn't speculation, it's arithmetic. America's national debt just crossed $36 trillion, climbing by $1 trillion every 100 days, which means by the end of this decade we're looking at a debt load near $50 trillion. And that's assuming we avoid a recession, avoid war, avoid a financial crisis, avoid a major disaster, and avoid a collapse in GDP growth. In other words, it assumes fantasy-level stability. Meanwhile, interest payments on the debt have overtaken defense spending, hitting $1.1 trillion per year, which means the U.S. government now spends more servicing old debt than protecting the country with the largest military in the world. And here's the deadly feedback loop. As debt rises, interest payments rise. As interest payments rise, the government borrows more to cover the interest. As it borrows more, global lenders demand higher yields. And as yields rise, interest payments rise again. That is the definition of a debt spiral. Historically, once a nation spends more on interest than on public services, social programs collapse. Once it spends more on interest than on its military, geopolitical power collapses. And once it spends more on interest than it collects in income taxes, sovereignty collapses. The U.S. is inching dangerously close to all three. And the idea that we can grow our way out is mathematically impossible when GDP grows at 2% while debt grows at 8 to 12%. Wall Street analysts know this. Foreign governments know this. The IMF knows this. The Congressional Budget Office knows this. The American people are the last to accept it because denial is easier than acknowledging that the monetary order they grew up with is dying, and the moment a nation realizes it cannot pay its bills, everything changes. Currencies weaken, allies hedge against collapse, trade shifts to rival systems, and the global role of that nation begins to dissolve. This isn't theoretical. It's the script followed by Britain, Spain, the Ottomans, the Romans, and now it's being followed by the United States. Debt is not the crisis. The crisis is that the American system depends on borrowing to function at all. And when borrowing becomes the only strategy left, collapse is no longer a possibility, it becomes a timeline. One of the clearest signs that a nation is entering its collapse phase isn't GDP contraction or even currency instability, it's when the social fabric begins to unravel faster than institutions can contain it. And right now, the United States is experiencing a level of internal conflict, polarization, and institutional distrust that rivals the late-stage breakdown of every major empire in recorded history. You don't need cable news to see it. You feel it on the streets, at the grocery store, on social media, at school board meetings, in the workplace, everywhere. Americans are no longer disagreeing, they're despising, distrusting, and disconnecting from one another at scale. More than 71% of Americans say the country is on the brink of civil conflict, according to a recent Quinnipiac survey. 43% believe political violence is now justified under certain conditions. Trust in the media has collapsed to an all-time low of 27%. Trust in Congress sits at 8%. Trust in the justice system, the police, the electoral process, and public health institutions has deteriorated across every demographic and political category. When a nation's people stop believing their institutions are legitimate, the institutions lose the ability to govern. And layered on top of this distrust is the widening cultural divide that's now hardened into something resembling two incompatible realities. Blue states and red states aren't just disagreeing, they're passing contradictory laws that create parallel legal systems. From abortion access to gun rights to environmental policy to voting rules, you now effectively have two Americas occupying the same landmass, each believing the other represents an existential threat. And this is happening while violent crime in major metros rises, homelessness increases 11% year over year, shoplifting spikes across cities like San Francisco and Chicago, and mental health crises overwhelm schools and emergency rooms. Add to that the addiction epidemic, over 112,000 overdose deaths last year, the highest in U.S. history, and you see what a collapsing social order looks like. This isn't chaos caused by poverty alone. It's the downstream result of a nation where millions of people feel abandoned, alienated, and unheard. Historically, once internal disorder reaches this level, you do not return to normal without major restructuring. Whether through political realignment, secessionist pressures, or a forced national reset, something always breaks. A nation can survive recession, it can survive inflation, but it cannot survive the moment its citizens stop believing they share a future together. The global power shift that is leaving America behind, and the rise of a new world order. If you want to understand where America sits in the global hierarchy right now, you have to look beyond domestic politics and follow the cold arithmetic of geopolitics, because this is where the collapse becomes undeniable. For the first time since World War II, the United States is no longer the uncontested leader of the global economic system. And that's not an opinion. The numbers tell the whole story. In 1999, the U.S. controlled 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. Today, that number has fallen to 58%, the lowest in modern history. Meanwhile, BRICS nations Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined by Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and others, collectively control nearly 31% of global GDP, surpassing the G7 for the first time ever. China now conducts more global trade than the United States, leads in manufacturing output, graduates more engineers per year, and controls more critical mineral supply chains than any country on Earth. Even more threatening to American dominance is the accelerating movement away from the U.S. dollar. Over the past 18 months alone, 24 countries have signed agreements to conduct trade in local currencies, yuan, rubles, or digital settlement systems. Saudi Arabia, the anchor of the petrodollar system since 1974, has now openly signaled its willingness to price oil in non-dollar currencies, something that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. Add to that the rapid expansion of China's digital yuan infrastructure, the emergence of cross-border crypto settlement networks, and gold accumulation at the fastest pace since 1967. Central banks bought 1,100 tons of gold in 2023, and you can see exactly what's happening. The world is preparing for a post-dollar era, and they're doing it more openly than ever because they no longer fear American retaliation. Military power is still an American strength, but geopolitical influence is slipping. Regional conflicts in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Asia are expanding simultaneously, stretching American resources thin, while adversaries test red lines with increasing boldness. Historically, when a dominant power loses economic leverage and requires military projection to retain influence, that's the late stage of an empire. And once the global system no longer depends on the dollar, once trade routes, commodities, and credit markets diversify away from U.S. control, America becomes just another nation, not the backbone of global stability. And nations in that position don't transition peacefully. They face crises, restructuring, and often identity collapse. This is the geopolitical chapter of America's decline, and it's accelerating faster than anyone expected. If you really want to understand why America is reaching the point of no return, you need to stop looking at Wall Street and start looking at something far more fundamental: the collapse of the American family structure and the accelerating population decline that guarantees a shrinking, aging, economically fragile nation. No empire in world history has survived a demographic implosion. Not Rome, not the British Empire, not the Soviet Union, and the United States is now experiencing one at breathtaking speed. Birth rates have fallen to 1.62 births per woman, the lowest in American history, and far below the replacement level of 2.1 needed to sustain a stable population. And this isn't a temporary dip. It's a structural decline driven by the economic hopelessness facing younger generations. 60% of Americans under 35 say they are delaying or forgoing having children entirely due to cost. The USDA now estimates the cost of raising a single child to age 18 at $287,000, not including college. Housing prices are so extreme that 71% of Gen Z say they do not believe they will ever be able to own a home. Meanwhile, childcare costs have risen 220% since the year 2000. And health insurance premiums for young families have skyrocketed to the point where many pay more for insurance than they do for rent. Add crushing student debt now sitting at $1.77 trillion, and what you have is an entire generation that simply cannot afford to reproduce. And when young people don't see a future in their own country, they don't build roots. They don't invest long-term, they don't create stable communities, and they don't carry forward the cultural identity of the nation. Last year, immigration was the only thing preventing the U.S. population from outright shrinking. Yet even that is no solution, because immigrants eventually face the same economic pressures, the same inflated costs, the same lack of upward mobility. And here's the part nobody is prepared for. By 2034, for the first time in U.S. history, the elderly will outnumber children, creating a dependency ratio that will break every social system: Social Security, Medicare, pensions, elder care, the labor supply. No empire has ever survived the moment its working-age population shrinks while its elderly population explodes. This is the demographic tipping point, the one from which nations do not recover. The collapse of America isn't happening because people don't love their country. It's happening because the country has become economically incompatible with family life. And once a nation stops replacing itself, collapse becomes baked into its future. The United States has lost its national purpose, its shared identity, and its unifying story. And when a nation loses the story that holds it together, everything else, economics, politics, institutions, culture, begins to disintegrate from the inside out. For most of the 20th century, America's identity was crystal clear: a rising superpower, a leader in innovation, a champion of freedom, a land of opportunity, a country where each generation lived better than the last. That narrative created cohesion. It gave people something to aspire to. It justified sacrifice. But in 2026, Americans no longer agree on what the country stands for, what its future should look like, or even what it means to be an American. 81% say the nation is more divided than at any point in their lifetime. 72% believe the American dream is no longer attainable. 64% believe the political system is corrupted beyond repair. And for the first time ever, a majority of young people say they would leave the United States if given the opportunity. The cultural fragmentation is so deep that Americans now live in different realities depending on what state they're in, what media they consume, and what political identity they've adopted. There is no longer a shared moral compass, no shared national vision, no shared future. And that is fatal. Because empires do not collapse when enemies invade, they collapse when the population stops believing the empire is worth saving. Every fallen empire reaches a moment when its people grow cynical, hopeless, and disconnected from the national project. Rome had this moment. The Ottomans had this moment. The British Empire had this moment. And now America is having it. When trust collapses, when national pride evaporates, when citizens feel no obligation to the collective future, the country becomes a loose collection of individuals rather than a unified civilization. And here's the part most people refuse to accept. Once a nation loses its purpose, no amount of economic reform, no political election, no policy change can restore it. National purpose isn't legislated, it's lived. And America, for the first time, is a country whose people no longer believe in its story. That is the final stage of collapse. Not a recession, not inflation, not geopolitics. A nation that cannot tell itself who it is cannot survive. And unless the United States rediscovers a shared purpose, one rooted not in division, but in identity and collective destiny, the collapse isn't coming. It's already here. And that's the terrifying part. This isn't a prediction. It's the reality you're already living in. America isn't heading toward collapse. The collapse has already started. And most people won't wake up until it steamrolls their job, their savings, and their future. If you think this gets better on its own, it won't. The systems are failing by design. So the real question now is simple. Are you going to prepare for what's coming or pretend this country isn't falling apart right in front of you? Let me know what you think America's breaking point will be, because the clock is already ticking.